So Malcolm, first thing I'd love to ask you about the future of work is if you look at all the lessons you've picked up through revisionist history, through studying the past, what are some of the biggest lessons from the past around how we can create a better world of work in the future?
Oh, wow. Well, I guess, one of the things I've, like many people, have been very interested in is why did a world of work where decision-making was dominated by a very, very small class of people persist for as long as it did, right? So I totally get why in 1900 the leadership of every major corporation in this country was a Protestant white male, right? That's 1900. And I even sort of understand that in 1930 by the idea that stranglehold on positions of authority by an incredibly small group would have persisted for as long as it did is surprising to me, right? Why would you, I remember in one of my books, I did that whole thing where I went down the list of Fortune 500, or was it Fortune 100 companies, and asked how tall each CEO was, and discovered that they weren't just all white men, they were all tall white men, which is the most absurd thing you've ever can think about, because I then calculated what percentage of the American population is a white, middle-aged male over 6'1" in height, and it's like this much, right? So to run major corporations, we draw from a pool that's like this big. You got to be all of these things. It would be like if you were, you wanted to made a stipulation that the entire faculty at Penn had to be people who were, born and raised in Trenton, New Jersey. It's literally it's like that. It's like, can you imagine if you could only draw from Trenton? I'm not dissing Trenton, but you have severely restricted your talent pool if you're saying it's got to be within, the four. So that's what we did. And we did it for years, and we persisted, and we still do it. And I don't understand why that lasted so long. And so one question is there something about the culture that we created in companies that allowed that to persist longer than it should have? And there must be, right? And I got really interested in this question of, and I won't go into the reason why because it's a long, complicated digression, but that maybe the enemy of true diversity in those situations is the desire of those in charge to be comfortable. And that what we really should be doing in companies is making people uncomfortable, or at least comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that notion of being uncomfortable, the minute I sort of started to think about this, and I started to look around, because I have this little company now that I started with my friend. We have 70 employees. So I begin to see this everywhere, that the desire to be comfortable actually trumps the desire to be good at what we do, the desire to take chances, the desire to experiment, the desire to, a lot of when we don't listen to people, it's not because we are actively prejudicial towards them or their type. It's that someone who's different from me makes me a little uncomfortable because they make me think about things that I don't want to think about at the moment. Right?
Well, yeah, there are actually, I think, some interesting data to speak to this. So the psychologist Marilyn Brewer wrote that the majority of everyday discrimination is driven not by out-group hate, but in-group love, right? That I just prefer to be with people who look like me and are similar to me, which you probably know the classic Schelling simulation where he just tracked what happens if even a third of a neighborhood prefers to have a racially similar neighbor. So as a white person, if I would like it if my next door neighbors were also white, if even a third of the neighborhood has that preference, we get complete racial segregation.
Yeah.
And that's what you're describing, right?
Yeah. Is that...
The other data point that comes to mind is the brilliant work by the late, great Kathy Phillips, who showed that in homogeneous groups, we rate our performance higher when we have to make decisions and solve creative problems because we were more comfortable. And in more heterogeneous groups, we think we performed worse, but we actually did better, and one of the mechanisms is the discomfort. That when you are slightly uncomfortable in a group, you prepare more, you explain yourself more clearly, you listen more carefully, and all of that is good for a group process. And so I think you're onto something here, that if we could normalize discomfort and say that is actually a sign of growth, then we can make it a little bit easier for people to stop replicating their own group as running the show.
And what's interesting as well about this is that there is a countervailing cultural trend at the moment, which is trying to reduce discomfort in group settings, right? And I don't think people have properly understood the extent to which that may be contradicting efforts to create a diverse workforce. I think you need to rehearse being uncomfortable. Because the next way that you're uncomfortable is not going to be that. It's going to be some different way. And you need to be fine with feeling a little weird about what someone's saying or doing.
Well, so there's a movement in education to replace the safe spaces concept with brave spaces and say, look, we don't want to protect your feelings and prevent you from hearing arguments you don't like. We want to teach you to have the courage to challenge those arguments.
Yeah.
That is an easy case for me to make as a white man, right? And say, like, yeah, I don't mind being uncomfortable. It's not so easy if you're a member of an underrepresented group. Mm-hmm. And so how do you think about drawing the line between we want to challenge people and invite a little bit of discomfort in service of learning, but not go so far as to threaten people's identities?
Well, I would say that it depends. So that there are some cases where the level of discomfort borne by the underrepresented group is going to be greater. But I'd also say that there are also cases where that's not true. So I think that if you are truly Catholic in your, small c Catholic, in your desire to introduce uncomfortable moments into the workplace, everyone should have a moment where they feel uncomfortable. In other words, what you described is a situation where we just haven't come up with things to make the white guy uncomfortable. I mean, we can do that, right? We can.
Some would say the past few years have been that experiment. Yeah. I think that's extremely valuable. If you can't recognize the role of luck and opportunity in your success, then that's a recipe for entitlement, right? Thinking you deserve every single advantage you got.
Yeah. But wait, Adam, I'm surprised you didn't say, aren't there moments where uncomfortable is not a good thing? So we've got a little continuum here, whereas what is the cost of uncomfortable? The cost of uncomfortable is at least the perception of some degree of friction in the way people interact. So let me give you another example from we had a guy who worked for our company, who worked very closely with me, and who was a rabble-rouser in what I recognize as in a good way, who made me very, very uncomfortable in many contexts, would say things that would shock me, would speak out of turn, would raise objections to lots of things I did, and who would infuriate me on many occasions. He probably was responsible for more productive thinking on my part than anyone else. But he also made my life a lot more difficult. Like, there was one instance where I realized I was sending him, he worked down the hall from me. I was sending him an email, and I was at word 3,000 in the email, and I was like, Jesus, Malcolm, you have lost your mind. This guy is inside your head. Did he affect my productivity? Absolutely. But I also learned, he forced me to re-examine all kinds of things I wouldn't. So there was a cost, though. Do I always want to pay that cost, is the question. Are there situations where I don't?
Well, the first question I would ask is, it sounds like you have someone intensely disagreeable on your hands. And I want to know, is he doing that in service of giving or taking? Is he trying to help you get better? Is he trying to advance the organization's mission? Or is he trying to advantage his own ideas?
I think he's trying to do, both. I didn't think his objections, the reason I would write a 3,000-word email to him is I thought his objections came from a legitimate place. That is to say, he wasn't just being a jerk. He had no, he was completely uninterested in the fact that I was his boss, which I thought was kind of, in retrospect, deeply fascinating and kind of cool.
What I would ask is, can we create a mechanism to channel it and make him more constructive? So I'm thinking about what Google did years ago, where they had engineers who would just just obliterate a plan that was introduced, even if it seemingly wasn't going to affect them. Like, well, we're going to move our quarterly reviews from March to February. Mutiny! You can't do that! We planned our whole lives around this. You're messing up our perfectly engineered system. And then at some point, Laszlo Bock, who was running HR at the time, said, oh, well, these are the canaries in the coal mine. Why don't I give them that status? Mm-hmm. And why don't I run by them all my ideas before I roll them out and get slammed for the bad decision I made, and then we can pressure test them, right? So that's a valuable function. Those people are, are reading the signals early, and maybe push-in isn't big enough yet.
Yeah.
For that group.
No, I like, what I love about that is that idea that depending on your perspective, someone can both be an irritant or a canary in a coal mine, an incredibly useful kind of sounding board for what you're doing. And it's too easy. This goes back to this question of why did a culture persist for as long as it did that enshrined the values and privilege of a small group of people. And that is that they only saw irritants. They didn't see canaries in a coal mine.
All right, let me ask you a few other questions about the future of work. One is, how do you think effective leadership is going to evolve in the next decade?
Well, I mean, I suppose it depends on how long we think the present state of affairs lasts. So we've moved very quickly and dramatically to this distributed remote work model. And if that's the new norm, the question is, what does leadership look like in a distributed model, right? And I don't know the answer to that, but my suspicion is the kinds of things that would make you an effective leader in an environment that is overwhelmingly face-to-face might be very different in a model where everyone is scattered. So we've talked about this before, that evaluating talent, it can get quite critical, can get quite difficult when I never see you. And learning is different if you're younger. Like, I was talking to someone recently, but when I started at the Washington Post in the 1980s, Bob Woodward, the greatest investigative reporter of all time, his desk was essentially there. I was 22 years old. I didn't know anything about journalism. And the greatest reporter in the history of reporting was there. And I sat there for my first year, and I just watched him. And it was the most important learning experience of my entire life. Just seeing the way he conducted himself, the kinds of questions he asked, how hard he worked. That was the most amazing thing. He was a guy who was at the height of his career. He was the guy who broke the Watergate story. He was the most famous journalist in America. He could have coasted. He was the hardest working. Look around. Nobody worked harder than him. Nobody. I could listen to the way he talked to people on the phone. It was just so different than I thought. I thought journalism was about being confrontational, and he was the guy who was whispering sweet nothings into the ear of his sources. It was just a mind-blowing thing, but that was because he was there.
But right? Malcolm, come on. This is so unfair. All the people who didn't get to sit next to him, right, were disadvantaged. And now we could invite all of you to Bob Woodward's Zoom. You can all watch him in action, and we're going to have that many more good reporters. No. We could have 6 Malcolm Gladwells writing, I don't know, how many tipping points could there be?
So, no. Is the benefit of a distributed workforce that we can expose more people to those kinds of experiences, but at the cost of the quality of the experience, right?
Sure.
So there is a richness and a kind of to the fidelity of my observations of him at that close range were an order of magnitude greater than they would have been if we were just online.
I agree there's a trade-off there, but what I love is, this is a full-scale strategy to stop the abuse of interns and junior employees, right? Well, guess what? We're going to invite the entire 100-person intern class to watch you in action as a leader and attend all your Zooms. And guess what? If you are disrespectful to people, if you are constantly undermining people, that behavior is going to get rooted out really quickly. So I kind of love this.
I do, one of the interesting things about COVID is it did force us, I think, to reflect in a really important way on what is important about face-to-face, right? I've gone from thinking that universally face-to-face is best, to now being much more selective. But there are certain situations and times where you just can't be 100 miles away, right? It's just not. Yeah. And like knowing when that is, I mean, maybe that's in answer to your question, what does leadership look like? Leadership now has to have this particular skill about understanding the kinds of experiences that people need to better themselves, because now there's a range, right?
Yeah, so I have to be much more dedicated to skill development and mentoring than I was before.
I think much more, yeah.
Yeah, I like that. And it also makes me wonder, so when we think about the future of skill development, you're going to college today. What are you going to major in? What skills do you want to learn?
If I was starting out, the first thing I would do is I would say, I would tell my parents this. I would say, I'm not interested in grades. In other words, the single biggest mistake I made when I went to college is I chose courses on the basis of how well I thought I could do in them.
That's never happened here.
That was the dumbest thing. All I did was do the kinds of things that I already knew how to do. What I would do if I did it again is I would deliberately pursue things that I knew nothing about and thought I would probably fail at, because that's where I would learn the most. But I could only do that if I abandoned the fantasy that I would be a A+ student. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I think I would do, I would be much more interested in doing things in teams. And that, I don't mean that in a strictly academic, I would have involved myself much more in activities at school that involved working with people. Because only after I graduated did I realize that that's actually what the world is about, Don't really understand. One of the ways, an interesting school to create would be a school in which everything was team-based, right? Imagine if you applied to school as part of a team and you were only evaluated over all 4 years as a part of, not the same team all the time, but just everything was team-based, everything. Isn't that interesting? If I'm an employer, that would be incredibly interesting to me. I could talk to your teammates, I
think you just created a mechanism for punishing all the conscientious people in the world and saying, guess what? You're going to have to carry the load of 9 people instead of just your own because you've got a bunch of social loafers and slackers on your team.
But do you think that would be, I'm serious, is that ultimately more useful for the conscientious person? Or not? Does it dispirit them?
I think it's a really easy way to burn them out. I don't know. Let me ask you something else, which is when we talk about teams, you did a podcast episode about weakest link versus strongest link teams.
Yeah.
Like basketball teams where you're only as good as your best player versus soccer teams where you're only as good as your worst player. Which do you think is going to dominate the future of work?
Soccer. So, I don't know why, but as I've gotten older...
Which is always a good, by the way, explanation for having an opinion. Here's my theory, but I don't have a justification for it at all. I have no data.
No. So I'm open to suggestion on this, but why is it, do you think, that as I've gotten older, I'm less and less interested in elite performance and more interested in... So there's 2 paradigms here. I did this little newsletter thing on comparing the singer-songwriter Paul Simon with, say, the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones have 4 great albums, all done between 1968 and 1972, and after that, they're done. Paul Simon has no individual album that's as good as Let It Bleed or Sticky Fingers, but he produces great music for 40 years. Those are 2 extremes, 2 models. As I've gotten older, I'm uninterested in the Rolling Stones model and really interested in the Paul Simon model. What I'm interested in is longevity, consistency, productivity, and that is consistent with, I'm interested in these, the basketball model is all that matters is that you have LeBron and Steph Curry. And the 5th best player on the Golden State Warriors could literally be someone off the street. It just doesn't matter.
That's an experiment we should run, by the way.
They ran it. They had a big, slow, lumbering white guy for years on that great team. He is the useless. He's from Australia, for goodness sake. It didn't matter. They were still fantastic. They did it. In basketball, you don't need 5 great players. You need 3 great players. And then it's just all bets are off. In soccer, if you have one bad player, it can destroy your entire. That's the whole point, right? The soccer model, to my mind, is really and like I said, I'm open to suggestion on this, but it strikes me that that's the modern world. The weak link. The idea that the work of all of the brilliant people can be undone by some, relatively prosaic, overlooked, forgotten person at the bottom. To my mind, that is what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing in Russia versus Ukraine. That's what we're seeing in all these things. It's like, I remember a friend talking to me about a doctor friend of mine who was talking about an operation he had done, this heroic 12-hour operation saving the life of some guy where, it was unbelievable. They saved him. He went, after some terrible car crash, he went home, and then he collapsed 2 years later and nearly died, had to have his leg amputated. Why? Because they forgot to give him, if you take out someone's spleen, you got to give someone a vaccination, a shot for a bacterial thing. So there's like a $5 shot they forgot to do. It's $1 million operation with this. And that was like to my mind, that's so the modern world, right? It's like, if everything is going to be interconnected, then everyone needs to have a certain level of competence. So I almost don't care if my best player is in the 70th percentile. I'm fine with that so long as my worst player is in the 60th percentile. What I don't want is my best player who's 95th percentile and everything she does is undone by the fact that my worst player is in the 15th percentile, right? And we have systematically pursued in this country a model over the last hundreds of years where we're just interested in creating a small class of people who are really, 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 really good. And we're totally indifferent to the bottom of the distribution. And I just think that doesn't work anymore.
So we're going to kill the winner-take-all economy, you're suggesting?
I don't, for most things in your life, you don't need the 95th percentile person. You just need, when you go to the doctor, what do you care about? You care that the nurse smiles at you and listens to you, and you don't need to have an IQ of 170 to do that, right?
Is that what you care about when you go to the doctor? Like, I care about getting good health care.
But you're in the high, I'm Canadian. No, it's like, good enough is good enough. Like, I mean, you've just expressed to me exactly what's wrong with the American healthcare system, which is you're so obsessed with the 0.0001% chance that you will be in need of a Nobel Prize winning surgeon that you abandon the other 99.99999% of occasions where all you need is pretty good. Pretty good's fine.
Well, I think that's a powerful message for us to wrap on. Pretty good is fine. You heard it here first. Malcolm Gladwell is telling you, you do not need to be great. You do not even need to be good. You just need to be pretty good.
Adam, I'm not letting you end on that. It's nonsense. What matters is that I would say, pay more attention to whether the person at the bottom of the distribution is pretty good than you pay attention to whether the person at the top of the distribution is world class. That's how I would phrase it.
That is a less empowering message for a bunch of overworked, burned out people, but probably a more accurate one too. Malcolm, as always, thank you for joining us. This has been such a delight. Excited to continue this discussion and talk a little bit about the future of work. Let me just ask you, is there anything you've rethought in the couple weeks since we had that conversation?
Of course. I mean, I like to rethink everything I say the instant I say it. No, I guess, no, I mean, those are the general themes, I think, are things that, there's certainly things I am actively thinking about, but I wouldn't say there's massive revision.
I'm a little disappointed. I was hoping we'd have more to fight about, but I'll find something. Let's start with one of the big themes in the audience questions, which is, if you want to provoke discomfort in the workplace, how do you do that in a way that enables people to feel a sense of belonging and doesn't encourage people to provoke for the sake of being provocative?
Yeah, that question puts, it goes to the heart of what's difficult about discomfort. I guess I would answer this by looking at the opposite. So what are the costs associated with a workplace that privileges comfort at all costs? And the cost of that is it's it's an exclusive environment. It's an environment where a lot of people who are like a lot of other people hire people who are like themselves and keep any kind of friction to a minimum. And by friction, I mean anything associated with difference. And so that's at one extreme. And I'm saying let's move the needle over a little bit in the other direction where we're willing to tolerate a little bit of friction in order to get some fresh air into the kind of ruling structures of organizations. And does that run the risk of making people feel um, a little disjointed? And sure, but I'd rather have that. To my mind, the costs of the former are so great, I'm willing to incur a little bit of that kind of friction at the other side.
So let's stretch that a little further. Angela Duckworth and Carol Dweck were talking earlier, and Angela was musing about whether there might be a cost of growth mindset. And I started thinking about that, and I thought of some data that Konstantinos Koudaferis and Marissa Shandell and I had collected, showing that when you develop a growth mindset or when you have one naturally, you're more likely to persist in impossible tasks because you believe, I can always master this skill. I can get better. It's worth it to keep trying, instead of saying, like, maybe this is not where my greatest strengths lie. I should cut my losses. And that seems like the kind of uncomfortable idea that you delight in, that there might be a time and a place for people to have more fixed mindsets. Wondered if we could get you to riff on that a little bit.
Oh, that's super interesting. One of the questions I always had about, remember writing about Carol Dweck's work years ago. It's always fascinated me. And I've always wondered, the question I always had was, do these paradigms, are they unitary? That is to say, is a person a fixed or a growth person, or are they situational? And the more I sort of would observe these mindsets in the wild, the more I came to believe that they were situational, that there are certain parts in our life where we did take, for many reasons, maybe just the kind of for social efficiency reasons, we were fixed in certain aspects. This is who I am. This is the way I'm going to see the world, and I'm not going to be turning it upside down. And then maybe the kind of safety that you get from being fixed in one area is what allows you the freedom to have a growth mindset in other areas. Certainly the happiest people I know are people who combine the best of both of those models. You can't be on the treadmill, in every single aspect of your life simultaneously. It's why people are. I was reading this. There's a famous book written by Vivian Gornick. She was a red diaper baby, grew up in New York, and she was talking about how when in her parents' little apartment in the Bronx in the 30s, the arguments never stopped, and everything was on the table for discussion, and how at first exhilarating and then ultimately exhausting that was, right? There was a case where, they were people of a generation who were engaged in a never-ending project of trying to make the world a better place. And I think it just burned her out after a while. I don't think you can do that in every aspect of your life.
I love that perspective, the idea that I need to be fixed in a few domains in order to pursue growth in one or two. That I actually think that makes a growth mindset more palatable, because it's always felt daunting to me to say, like, yes, I could potentially improve at anything, but where do I want to invest my energy, and what's the return on investment going to look like? It's probably going to be limited if I take on too many things at once.
Yeah, it's why I've always been curious, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but anecdotally, one observes that in families, when people go home to their family, they revert to a kind of very particular personality, the kind of mode they were in when they were, I don't know, teenagers or whatever. I've always observed this. And I'm wondering, in the context of this conversation, whether that isn't actually in some ways a wonderful thing. It's what allows you to kind of bask in the safety and support of your family, that you're not trying to be someone else. Right? You're just your same old truculent 12-year-old self, and you can accept your mother's love and like not fight it and not try to be an adult, in that moment. And that's like why you want to go home.
Spoken by someone with an unusually functional family, clearly.
Well, it's true. Yes, I did. I was blessed with. I'm blessed with a very warm and loving mom.
Speaking of family, Malcolm, it must have been a decade ago that I asked you, I remember we were on stage and I asked you what your biggest regret was in life. And Dan Pink was here with us earlier talking about regrets. And I remember you saying very poignantly, I wish I had had children. And you have. You're a new dad.
I am.
So tell us now what your biggest regret is, having crossed that one off your list.
I don't think I have one. I mean, all my other regrets, I have them, but they're so trivial in comparison that it seems pointless now to bring them up. Like, I regret that I didn't go to college in a distant country. I mean, is that on par with not having children? It's not. It's an absurd kind of like, I wish that I'd hung out with people who spoke a different language when I was 19. I mean, come on, let's not have. I think I've retired from the regrets game.
Impressive.
Is it? I mean, is that normal for a new parent? I think that's what young parents go through. They're like, everything else seems to fade in comparison.
Well, one, there's nothing normal about you. Two, I think that in many cases, having children intensifies people's regrets in other domains because they realize how many things they should have done before they had kids and then can't for a period of time. That is a whole nother conversation.
When you have kids at 58, I pretty much have done everything already. So,
touche. I want to just double click a little bit on the historian perspective here and ask whether you think we've got a lot of leaders in the audience today. Do you think that organizations should have historians? And if so, what should they be doing every day?
Well, so why do you have a historian? You have a historian if you're interested in the culture of your organization, right? Because if you're interested in understanding what your organization stands for on some kind of deeper symbolic level, then you need to have someone around who knows where you came from. And I've often thought, there are certain companies that I've interacted with and where it's not that I love the culture, but I love the notion that they have a culture, the specificity of it. Like, you walk into Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, you know what Procter & Gamble is, right? Actually, that's a culture I love. And they've managed to, it's been that way for, 100 and some odd years. That's something lovely. But the only way you can have that is if you're interested in where you came from and what your roots were. I once talked to a Procter guy who gave this brilliant analysis about how everything Procter does to this day dates from the particular kind of soap the original German founders were making in it was like this genius thing, how everything comes from like the pork tallow or whatever the hell they were using back in 1860. But like that idea that people are in touch with where their organization comes from is really beautiful to me, because it gives you a reason, it gives you a sense of belonging, and it gives you a reason to be loyal, right? You know what you're being loyal to. It's why the Army spends so much time. When we teach kids, when they go to military academy at West Point or whatever, what do you learn? Well, you learn a lot of history. And it's not just because you learn lessons about how to be an effective leader from your own history. You're also trying to learn, what is the organization that I'm joining? What do they stand for? Why would I die for this organization? Right? That's hugely important.
It reminds me of one of my favorite findings from developmental psychology, which is that if you study children's resilience, one of the unexpected predictors is how much they know about their family history, going back generations. And there's something about being connected to the past that allows you to remember that my struggles are normal. They're not unique to me. It gives you a sense of self-compassion. Other people have suffered too. Like, this is not the worst thing to ever happen to anyone. It maybe gives you a sense of legacy as well. And I think when I see organizations try to do this, it honestly creeps me out a little bit because it becomes this indoctrination session where you're expected to drink the Kool-Aid of the past, as opposed to, let's examine our roots, but let's also tear up some of those roots and look at what's wrong with them so that we can try to grow something a little bit healthier in the future. You've had a chance to plant some of these seeds recently in building Pushkin. Any thoughts on how we can respect the past, but also not get stuck in the limitations of it?
Wait, I want to go back. Can I go back to the very first thing you said, which had never occurred to me until now? it's a super interesting point, which it made me think immediately of Jews in the Holocaust. That an unspeakable thing happens to a group of people, but who had as part of their history and culture an understanding and uh, knowledge of and respect. Maybe respect is the wrong word for all of the travails that they had gone through as a culture over the course of thousands of years. So it's like when you try and answer the question of what explains the extraordinary resilience of the Jewish culture in the wake of the Holocaust, that's a huge part. It never occurred to me. I mean, I'm sure it's occurred to many people before, but that's the cultural version of what you were just talking about with kids, right? Can you imagine if that had happened to a cultural group that did not have that kind of historical perspective on their own struggles over the years? I mean, a culture without any kind of, in other words, reservoirs of resilience. I mean, it would have been. I mean, anyway, it's a total digression. But
no, it's actually not a digression. So let me pick up on it a little bit. So Samir Nur Muhammad on our faculty just published this great paper about underdog narratives, where he looked at people who are searching for a job, and he showed that if you have a history of adversity or discrimination, it's actually better to tell a story about how you faced and overcome obstacles than it is to talk about how your odds are great. And that pulling on this past of, yes, like I've been in tough circumstances before, but I have overcome it. It allows you to learn lessons from your own past resilience, and it also motivates you to say, I can probably do this again. And I think what you're suggesting is that that culturally, collectively, right, there's value in being able to construct this underdog narrative and retell it at critical points, which I guess could have been a chapter of David and Goliath.
Yes, good. But that phrase, pick up on the phrase you just used about constructing a narrative. That's the key thing here. It's like, it's not just having the experience, it's knowing how to turn that experience into a story that can be passed down, that can move people, that can be central to people's understanding of themselves. I mean, to go back to the Jewish example, that's of course what does centuries and centuries of biblical scholarship, study of the Talmud, what does that do? That's exactly what it's doing, right? It's the construction of a powerful cultural narrative. And that, I wonder, I think we spend way too little time in many parts of our life constructing those kinds of historical narratives. I totally agree with the work of they're incredibly important, particularly if you are coming from a group that has struggled. The WASPs of New England don't need these cultural narratives, but others of us do.
Well, let's take this narrative theme a step further then. I think going back to 2000, when I first read The Tipping Point, I remember telling some friends of mine who hadn't come across your work yet, it's as fascinating as reading fiction, only it's based on facts. And this is what storytelling about social science ought to look like. You are the favorite storyteller of so many people at this conference. I wonder if you could look ahead into your crystal ball 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, pick your window of time, and you are going to write the story of how the pandemic has changed work in the long run. Tell us what that story ought to look like.
Well, I would be interested. Well, so picking up on the themes that we've just been talking about, the most interesting stories out of the pandemic are stories about adversity, right? Of people dealing with an unexpected shock in a creative way. Those are the stories I think that we will be drawn to, and that will be the most meaningful and powerful out of the pandemic. Because to my mind, when I look at when I look at how people are reflecting on the experiences of the last 2.5 years, the balance is all wrong, and to my mind at the moment, we're still too caught up in the kind of the trauma and the suffering, which is real. I'm not saying we dismiss it, but alongside the trauma and the suffering, there has been this unbelievable explosion of innovation, of optimism, of reordering of the world, of getting people to reflect on things they'd never thought about before, of all of this kind of stuff's gone. I mean, I think I told you this, but I was talking to some guy who's an expert in supply chain management of all things. And the first thing he said to me, and he ran this business for IBM. I talked to him. First thing he said to me was, "Welcome to 2030." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "We are now where I thought we would only going to get to by 2030." In other words, we did 8 years of work in a year. That's the kind of story we'll be telling when we look back on the pandemic.
Well, that makes me think we ought to get 8 years off.
And the idea that you could take 8 days off is incredible to me. Is it? Let alone 8. There's no, Adam. The only way you're going to take 8 years off is if 7 years and 363 days of that are like when you're dead. It's like it's not happening.
All right, final question for you. I think we're going to hear on Revisionist History this season, you are obsessed with experiments. You think we should all be running more of them. Is there an experiment or two you think we should be running in our workplaces?
Workplaces. Oh, that's interesting. So as someone who, as you alluded to before, I helped start this company, Pushkin. We make audio stuff. And so now for the first time, I'm observing an organization growing around me. And I'm really, really interested in the idea of, can more people do a particular job than we think? So you always have these openings and you say, well, I got to get someone who can do this and this and this. And now all I can think of is, wait a minute, like, what if I just threw someone randomly into that job? Someone who I just knew was smart and hardworking. What is the relative importance of experience in the particular field I'm in? Now, I'm not asking this question if I'm running a heart surgery operation at an elite hospital, but in sort of fluid creative work like I'm in, am I overvaluing work experience when it comes to choosing people for various roles? And would there be a whole lot to be gained just by really routinely mixing people's work roles up? That is the experiment I'd like to run.
I love that experiment. I'll put in the chat. There's a meta-analysis, Chad Van Idekindge and colleagues. Work experience is massively overrated in most jobs, and it's probably going to become even more so. Yeah. It almost has no predictive value in the vast majority of work. So,
are you serious?
Yeah, you're onto something.
Now you tell me this? Adam, if you told me this 3 years ago, it would have changed everything we did at Pushkin. This is further proof of my rule that it's time to throw out the resume. I'm just not interested in the resume anymore. Nothing it tells me is of any use, right? It tells me where you went to school. I don't care. Now you're telling me I don't care about the particular experience. So why am I looking at your resume? Why don't I just go for a run with you and we have a long conversation?
If we can breathe on the way as you sprint past all of us, we'll see about that. Malcolm, always a joy. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the future.
Be well, Adam.